What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most with your soul was destroying your life behind closed doors? Have you ever felt invisible in your own marriage, watching your partner slip away while you desperately tried to hold on? Have you ever placed your complete faith in a spiritual leader, believing they would guide you toward salvation rather than devastation? Have you ever lived in a small town where everyone thinks they know everyone else's business, until a secret so explosive emerges that it shatters everything you believed about your neighbors? If any of these questions hit close to home, you're not alone. And what I'm about to share with you will make you question everything you think you know about trust, faith, and the people who hold power over our most vulnerable moments. In the heart of America's heartland, where church bells mark time and Sunday services bring communities together, a sacred bond was being weaponized. A man of God was using his position not to heal, but to destroy. A devoted wife and mother was being pulled into a web of deception that would cost her everything. And a hard-working husband was about to discover that the two people he trusted most had been plotting behind his back for months. But what happened when the truth finally exploded into the open would shock this tight-knit community to its core, leaving behind a brutal murder that remains unsolved to this day. Who pulled the trigger? Was it revenge, passion, or something far more calculated? Stay with me as we uncover the devastating truth behind one of the most disturbing betrayals in true crime history. Before we dive into this case, if stories about real people facing impossible choices fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel is dedicated to exploring the darkest corners of human nature while honoring the victims and seeking truth. Your support helps us continue bringing you these meticulously researched stories. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect to find murder. Nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, this was a town where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill, where high school football games brought out the entire community, and where the biggest scandal usually involved who forgot to bring dessert to the church potluck. The heartbeat of this community was the Willow Creek Fellowship, a modest church with white clapboard siding and a bell tower that had been calling faithful to worship for over 60 years. Every Sunday morning, you could count on seeing the same families filing through those wooden doors, the same voices raised in harmonious praise, the same sense of stability that small-town America promises. But what happens when the very foundation of that stability, the pastor who delivers salvation from the pulpit, the devoted choir member whose voice lifts spirits toward heaven, becomes the source of destruction? What happens when sacred vows become weapons, when trusted counseling sessions become opportunities for manipulation, and when a community's spiritual leaders become predators? This isn't just a story about an affair. This is about how one man's abuse of power and one woman's moment of vulnerability created a domino effect that would destroy multiple families, tear apart a congregation, and ultimately lead to a murder that police still can't definitively solve. Because in Willow Creek, the person everyone trusted to guide them through their darkest moments was creating those dark moments himself. And when the truth finally came to light, it would be too late to save anyone, especially Victor Ellsworth, whose only crime was loving the wrong people. The question isn't just who killed Victor Ellsworth. The question is, how many lives can one betrayal destroy? And in a town where everyone thought they knew everyone else's secrets, how did the most devastating secret of all stay hidden for so long? Let's find out. Reverend Alden Granger was everything a small-town pastor should be. At 42, he possessed the rare combination of intellectual depth and emotional warmth that made him equally comfortable delivering complex theological sermons and consoling grieving widows. When he'd arrived in Willow Creek 5 years earlier with his wife Helen and their 2 young children, the congregation had felt like they'd won the pastoral lottery. Alden remembered names, birthdays, and personal struggles with remarkable precision. He visited hospital patients without being asked, showed up at high school graduations, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when families faced their darkest hours. His sermons were passionate but never preachy, challenging but never condemning. Most importantly, he made people feel heard, understood, and valued. The church board, led by the formidable Eunice Harrow, had praised his leadership repeatedly. Under Alden's guidance, attendance had grown by 30%, youth participation had doubled, and the church's community outreach programs had expanded significantly. He was building something special at Willow Creek Fellowship, or so everyone believed. When Mara Ellsworth stepped up to the choir loft each Sunday morning, her voice could make hardened construction workers weep. She possessed one of those rare soprano voices that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human realm, pure, haunting, and absolutely mesmerizing. But it wasn't just her vocal talent that made her special. Mara had a genuine heart for worship and an infectious enthusiasm for the church's music ministry. At 36, she was the kind of woman who seemed to have it all figured out. Married to Victor for 15 years, mother to teenage son Jonah, active in every church committee that needed volunteers. She organized the annual Christmas pageant, coordinated meals for new mothers, and never missed a choir rehearsal. To the outside world, Mara Ellsworth was the embodiment of Christian womanhood, devoted, selfless, and unshakably faithful. But 12 months ago, everything changed when her mother passed away after a brutal battle with cancer. The woman who had been Mara's anchor, her best friend, her source of strength through every challenge, was gone. And despite being surrounded by loving family and a caring church community, Mara felt more alone than she ever had in her life. Victor Ellsworth was the kind of man you could count on. As the owner of Ellsworth Construction, he'd built his reputation on reliability, quality work, and treating his employees like family. He was up before dawn, home after sunset, and spent weekends either finishing projects or coaching his son's football team. Victor believed that hard work and integrity were the foundations of a good life, and he lived those values every single day. In his marriage to Mara, Victor was steady, dependable, and completely devoted. He might not have been the most emotionally expressive husband, but he showed his love through actions, working extra hours to pay for Jonah's college fund, taking on difficult projects to afford the family vacations Mara loved, never complaining when church activities kept her busy most evenings. Victor trusted completely and without reservation. He trusted his employees to do quality work, his clients to pay their bills, his son to make good choices, and his wife to be exactly who she appeared to be. This wasn't naivety, it was the confidence of a man who had never been given reason to doubt the people he loved. Every Sunday at 9:30 sharp, the bell at Willow Creek Fellowship would ring, calling the faithful to worship. The sanctuary could hold about 200 people, and most Sundays it was nearly full. Families who had attended for generations sat in the same pews their grandparents had occupied. Young couples brought babies who would be baptized in the same font where their parents had been blessed decades earlier. This wasn't just a church, it was the social, spiritual, and emotional center of the entire community. The fellowship hall hosted wedding receptions, funeral luncheons, high school graduation parties, and monthly community dinners. The church basement served as a polling place during elections and an emergency shelter during severe weather. When people in Willow Creek faced crisis, tragedy, or celebration, they turned to the fellowship. Consider what Sunday mornings looked like to any visitor walking into Willow Creek Fellowship. They would see Pastor Alden greeting each family personally, his warm smile and firm handshake making everyone feel like the most important person in the room. They would hear Mara's crystalline voice soaring above the congregation during opening hymns, her face glowing with what appeared to be pure joy. They would notice Victor sitting proudly in the third pew, his arm around his teenage son, the very picture of a devoted family man. But remember this crucial truth: the most dangerous predators often wear the most trusted faces. The most devastating betrayals happen between people who should be protecting each other. And sometimes the places we feel safest are where we're most vulnerable to destruction. Because while everything looked perfect from the outside, Mara was drowning in grief that no one seemed to understand. Victor was so focused on providing financially that he missed the emotional distance growing between them. And Alden, trusted, beloved Alden, was beginning to notice just how isolated and vulnerable Mara had become. The collision course was set. Three good people, each dealing with their own struggles, each making choices that seemed reasonable at the time. None of them could have predicted where those choices would lead. But someone should have seen the warning signs. Someone should have asked harder questions. Someone should have protected Mara from what was coming next. Instead, everyone just kept going to church, trusting in the facade of perfection that was about to destroy them all. It started with what seemed like genuine pastoral care. 3 weeks after Mara's mother's funeral, she approached Pastor Alden after choir practice, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't find meaning in anything anymore. The grief felt like it was consuming her from the inside out. "I think I need help," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty sanctuary. Alden's response seemed perfectly appropriate. "Of course, Mara. That's what I'm here for. Let's schedule some counseling sessions. Grief is a journey, and you don't have to walk it alone." Those sessions began in his office every Thursday evening after choir practice. At first, they were exactly what they should have been: discussions about faith, loss, and healing. Alden would open with prayer, they'd talk through Bible verses about comfort and hope, and he'd offer practical advice for managing her depression and anxiety. But somewhere around the fourth session, something shifted. Instead of maintaining professional boundaries, Alden began sharing his own struggles. He talked about feeling isolated in ministry, about the pressure of being everyone's spiritual leader while his own faith sometimes wavered. He described his marriage as comfortable but distant, and confessed that he often felt more like Helen's roommate than her husband. This is a classic manipulation tactic, though Mara didn't recognize it at the time. When authority figures share personal vulnerabilities, it creates a false sense of intimacy and equality. Suddenly, Mara wasn't just a grieving parishioner seeking help. She was Alden's confidant, the one person who truly understood his burdens. "You have such insight, Mara," he would tell her. "Talking with you helps me remember why I became a pastor in the first place." The sessions grew longer. What had started as 30-minute appointments stretched to an hour, then 2 hours. They began sitting closer together, first in chairs across from each other, eventually side by side on the small couch in his office. The physical proximity felt natural, necessary even when discussing such intimate emotional territory. Now, before we continue, I want you to think about this. How many warning signs do we ignore when someone we trust starts crossing lines? How often do we excuse inappropriate behavior because it comes from someone in a position of authority? Keep that question in mind as this story unfolds, because what happens next could have been prevented if anyone, including Mara herself, had recognized the red flags. By the 8th week, their conversations had shifted from discussing Mara's grief to exploring their special connection. Alden convinced her that their bond was evidence of God's plan, that perhaps her mother's death had brought them together for a divine purpose. "I've never felt this understood by anyone," he told her during what would be their last official counseling session. "Even Helen doesn't know me the way you do." When Mara expressed concern about the appropriateness of their relationship, Alden had an answer ready. David and Jonathan had a bond that surpassed the love of women. Sometimes God creates relationships that transcend normal boundaries. This is how spiritual abuse works, twisted theology used to justify inappropriate behavior. Alden was using his position as a biblical authority to redefine right and wrong, making Mara question her own moral compass. The night everything changed, Mara had been crying about missing her mother's voice. Alden moved closer, placing his hand over hers. "Your mother would want you to find comfort," he said softly. "She would want you to feel loved." When he kissed her forehead, Mara felt a combination of comfort and electric attraction that left her completely confused. When he kissed her lips moments later, she didn't pull away. Both Mara and Alden immediately began the mental gymnastics that allow good people to justify terrible choices. Mara told herself that this was different from ordinary adultery. This was a spiritual connection that transcended physical relationships. She convinced herself that God had brought them together to heal each other's wounds. Alden's rationalization was even more calculated. He had the theological training to construct elaborate justifications. He told Mara that David had multiple wives, that Solomon had hundreds of relationships, that biblical heroes often had unconventional romantic situations. He even suggested that perhaps modern marriage vows were human constructs that limited God's plan for love. Let me know in the comments, have you ever seen warning signs that you wish you'd acted on? Have you ever watched someone you cared about get manipulated by someone in authority? Your experiences might help other viewers recognize these dangerous patterns. Within 2 weeks, their relationship had become fully physical. They met in the church after hours, in Alden's office during lunch breaks, even in his car parked behind the cemetery. The thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, but so was the crushing weight of guilt. Both knew they were destroying their families, their reputations, and their faith community. But they also felt powerless to stop. The combination of sexual attraction, emotional dependency, and elaborate theological justification had created a perfect storm of self-deception. Neither realized that their secret was about to explode in the most devastating way possible. And when it did, the consequences would be far more terrible than either could have imagined. Because in small towns, secrets don't stay hidden forever. And when this secret emerged, it would leave one man dead and an entire community destroyed. Every affair requires an infrastructure of lies, and Mara and Alden were quickly becoming experts at deception. What had started as occasional late nights at church had evolved into an elaborate system of cover stories, fake appointments, and carefully coordinated alibis. Mara became particularly creative with her excuses. When Victor asked why she was staying late at church 3 nights a week, she told him about a new ministry for grieving families that required extensive planning. When he wondered about the weekend trips to visit her cousin, she would show him handwritten thank you notes she'd forged in advance. She even created fake phone numbers for imaginary church committee members who might call to confirm her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Alden's behavior at home was becoming increasingly erratic. Helen noticed that her husband, who had always been present and engaged with their children, was now distracted during family dinners, checking his phone constantly and finding excuses to leave the house for emergency pastoral visits that seemed to happen with unusual frequency. The man who had once shared every detail of his day was now vague about his activities. When Helen asked about his counseling sessions with Mara, he would become defensive. Patient confidentiality is sacred, Helen. I can't discuss the details of someone's grief journey. Helen wasn't buying it. Helen Granger had been a pastor's wife for 12 years. She knew the rhythms of ministry, the demands of pastoral care, and the legitimate reasons her husband might need to counsel struggling parishioners. But this felt different. She noticed how Alden's eyes would search the sanctuary for Mara during Sunday services, how his voice would change when he mentioned her name, how he would straighten his tie and check his appearance before their supposed counseling sessions. Most damning of all, she found a receipt for expensive perfume in his jacket pocket. Perfume that definitely wasn't the drugstore brand she wore. When she confronted him directly, Alden had explanations ready. Mara is going through tremendous grief. She needs more support than usual. But his answers felt rehearsed, and Helen's suspicions continued growing. Victor, unfortunately, was completely absorbed in work pressures. His construction company had landed the biggest contract in its history, renovating the entire Willow Creek High School, and the project was consuming 18-hour days. He would leave before Mara woke up and return after she was supposedly asleep. When he did notice changes in his wife's behavior, her new clothes, her improved mood, her sudden interest in working out, he attributed them to her finally recovering from her mother's death. "I'm glad you're feeling better," he would tell her, completely missing the guilty flush that crossed her face. Victor's trust was absolute and therefore dangerous. He never questioned Mara's explanations, never checked her stories, never suspected that the woman he'd loved for 15 years was capable of such devastating betrayal. But Willow Creek was a small town, and small towns notice everything. Eunice Harrow, the sharp-eyed church board chairwoman, observed that Pastor Alden and Mara seemed to have an unusual number of private conversations after services. Other choir members noticed that Mara's car was often the last one in the church parking lot on rehearsal nights. The whisper started quietly. "Have you noticed how much time Pastor Alden spends with Mara? Doesn't it seem odd that she needs so much counseling? Did you see the way they looked at each other during the offertory?" The lies nearly collapsed several times. Once, Victor came home early from a job site and found Mara's car gone, despite her claim of being sick in bed. She managed to convince him she'd driven to the pharmacy for medicine. Another time, Helen decided to surprise Alden at his office during what he'd claimed was a counseling session, only to find the building empty and locked. Each close call required more elaborate explanations, more creative cover stories, more people brought into the web of deception. This is where we see how one lie requires 10 more to sustain it. Every deception created the need for additional deceptions. Every cover story required backup plans and contingency alibis. The web they were weaving would soon trap them all, because maintaining lies becomes exponentially more difficult over time. What Mara and Alden didn't realize was that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse in the most devastating way possible. Because in a town where everyone watches everyone else, and where secrets are currency, the truth was bound to emerge. And when it did, the consequences would be far more terrible than either lover could have imagined. Thursday evening, October 12th. The choir had just finished rehearsing for the upcoming Harvest Festival, and Mara was riding the emotional high that always followed her most intimate encounters with Alden. In her distracted state, she did something that would destroy 3 lives forever. She left her phone on the piano in the church sanctuary. Victor arrived at 8:30 p.m. to pick up his wife, as he had dozens of times before. When he found the sanctuary empty and Mara's phone buzzing insistently on the piano bench, he felt no suspicion, just mild concern that she might be worried about missing calls. He picked up the device intending to find her and return it. But as he held it, another message notification appeared on the lock screen. And another. And another. The preview text was enough to stop his heart. "My darling Mara, I can still taste your kiss from this afternoon. When can we?" Victor's hands trembled as he unlocked the phone. He knew her passcode because they had always been completely transparent with each other. Or so he believed. What he found in those text messages was worse than his most paranoid imagination could have conjured. Months of intimate exchanges. Detailed plans for secret meetings. Love declarations that should have been reserved for spouses. And most devastating of all, mocking references to how clueless he was about what was happening right under his nose. One message from Alden read, Victor asked me how your grief counseling was going. I told him you were making remarkable progress. If only he knew what kind of healing we've been doing. Mara's response, poor Victor. He works so hard to provide for us, and he has no idea his wife belongs to another man now. Pause for a moment and consider this. Your entire world, everything you believed about your life, shattered in the span of reading a few text messages. That's the reality Victor faced that night. 15 years of marriage, a lifetime of trust, his faith in the pastor he'd respected, all destroyed by words on a screen that he couldn't unsee or unknow. When Mara emerged from the church office 20 minutes later, she found Victor sitting in his truck in the parking lot, her phone in his lap, tears streaming down his face. She knew immediately what had happened. Victor, I can explain? Explain what, Mara? Explain how you've been lying to me for months? Explain how you've been sleeping with our pastor? Explain how you've been laughing about how stupid I am. His voice wasn't angry yet, it was broken, desperate, the sound of a man watching his entire reality collapse. In the parking lot of the church where they'd been married, where their son had been baptized, where they'd celebrated and mourned and built their life together, Mara confessed everything. She tried to minimize it, to explain about her grief and vulnerability, to make Victor understand that it hadn't started as betrayal. But Victor wasn't hearing explanations. He was hearing confirmation that the woman he'd loved completely had chosen another man. That the pastor he'd trusted had violated that trust in the most intimate way possible. That his entire life had been a lie. When the reality fully hit him, Victor's grief transformed into rage unlike anything Mara had ever witnessed. He threw her phone against the church wall, shattering it completely. He screamed accusations and curses that echoed across the empty parking lot. He demanded to know how long, how many times, whether their son knew, whether everyone in town was laughing at him. By the next morning, everyone in Willow Creek knew. Victor had called his best friend Graham Porter that night, needing someone to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. Graham's wife told her sister. The sister told her book club. Within 24 hours, the scandal had reached every household in town. The perfect facade was destroyed. And soon, someone would be dead. By Friday afternoon, Eunice Harrow had called an emergency meeting of the Willow Creek Fellowship Board. The 7-member leadership team gathered in the church conference room, their faces grim with the weight of scandal that threatened to destroy their congregation. This is a crisis of leadership that demands immediate action, Eunice declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had shepherded this church through previous storms. Pastor Granger has violated his ordination vows, his marriage covenant, and the trust of every member of this congregation. The board was divided. 3 members wanted Alden immediately terminated and publicly condemned. 2 argued for restoration through counseling and accountability. The remaining 2 sat in stunned silence, still processing that their beloved pastor was capable of such betrayal. After 4 hours of heated discussion, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one. Alden would take an indefinite leave of absence while they conducted a formal investigation. He would not be allowed on church property or to contact any congregation members during this period. While the board debated Alden's future, Helen Granger was making the most difficult decision of her life. She found text messages on Alden's phone that confirmed her worst fears, and the evidence was undeniable. The man she'd married, the father of her children, the spiritual leader she'd supported through seminary and ordination, had destroyed everything they'd built together. By Saturday morning, Helen had packed 2 suitcases, loaded her crying children into the car, and driven to her sister's house 3 towns away. She left a single note on Alden's desk. You chose Mara over your family. Live with that choice. The Granger house, once filled with laughter and warmth, stood empty and silent, a monument to the destruction one affair could cause. Willow Creek split into hostile factions almost immediately. Team Mara blamed Alden entirely, viewing her as a vulnerable widow who was manipulated by a predatory pastor. They organized meals for her family and publicly defended her as a victim of spiritual abuse. Team Victor saw Mara as a scheming adulteress who had seduced their trusted pastor and destroyed 2 families. They rallied around Victor, praising his loyalty and condemning Mara's betrayal. A third faction blamed both equally, arguing that 2 adults had made selfish choices that devastated an entire community. The church's desperate attempts at damage control only made things worse. They brought in an interim pastor who preached about forgiveness, but half the congregation walked out during his first sermon. They organized community healing meetings that turned into shouting matches between opposing factions. Sunday attendance dropped from 180 to barely 60 within 2 weeks. Families who had worshipped together for generations suddenly couldn't sit in the same room. The annual Harvest Festival was cancelled. The youth group disbanded when parents couldn't agree on appropriate leadership. The scandal rippled beyond the church into every corner of Willow Creek life. Local businesses lost customers as former friends refused to shop where their enemies worked. The high school football team suffered when Victor and other parents stopped volunteering because they couldn't work alongside families who supported Mara. What had once been a tight-knit community became a collection of warring tribes, each convinced of their moral superiority and unwilling to find common ground. And in the midst of this chaos, tensions were escalating towards something far more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. Thursday, November 3rd. The kind of autumn night that makes you grateful for warm homes and locked doors. A storm front had moved through Willow Creek, bringing with it sheets of cold rain that hammered against windows and turned the town's quiet streets into rushing streams. Most residents were inside, settled in for the evening with hot coffee and television reruns. Victor Ellsworth was alone in his workshop behind the house, trying to lose himself in work the way he had every night since discovering Mara's betrayal 3 weeks earlier. The familiar rhythm of sanding, measuring, and cutting had become his only escape from the constant torment of replaying those devastating text messages in his mind. He'd been building a bookshelf for Jonah's bedroom, a project they'd planned to work on together before Victor's world imploded. Now it served as a desperate distraction from thoughts of his wife in another man's arms, from the humiliation of being the last person in town to know about his own marriage's destruction. The workshop had become Victor's refuge. Mara had moved in with her sister after their explosive confrontation, taking most of her belongings but leaving behind 17 years of shared memories that haunted every corner of their home. Jonah was staying with friends most nights, unable to handle the toxic atmosphere that had replaced his parents' former happiness. Victor worked by the light of a single overhead bulb, the storm outside matching the chaos in his head. He'd barely eaten in days, barely slept, barely spoken to anyone except his foreman about work schedules. His friends had tried reaching out, but Victor couldn't face their sympathy or their carefully worded questions about what he planned to do next. The radio played softly in the background, classic country songs about heartbreak and betrayal that seemed written specifically for his situation. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the workshop windows, followed by thunder that shook the small building's frame. At approximately 9:15 p.m., according to later testimony from neighbors, a car pulled into the Ellsworth driveway, the engine running for several minutes before shutting off. Footsteps across the gravel, heading toward the workshop where Victor spent his lonely evenings. No one saw who got out of that car. The storm provided perfect cover, and the Ellsworth property was isolated enough that neighbors couldn't make out details through the sheets of rain. But someone approached that workshop. Someone who knew Victor would be there. Someone who had come prepared for violence. At 9:47 p.m., a single gunshot cracked through the storm. The sound was sharp, definitive, and immediately followed by the slam of a car door and tires spinning on wet gravel as someone fled the scene in panic. Victor Ellsworth, age 43, devoted father and husband, hardworking contractor who had never harmed anyone in his life, was dead. A single bullet to the chest had stopped his heart instantly. He died surrounded by the tools he'd used to build homes for his neighbors, to provide for his family, to create something lasting in a world that had just proven how quickly everything could be destroyed. 45 minutes later, 17-year-old Jonah Ellsworth returned home from his friend's house, hoping to grab clothes for school the next day. The house was dark, which wasn't unusual. His father often worked late in the workshop when he couldn't sleep. But when Jonah opened the workshop door and turned on the lights, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His father's body lay crumpled beside the half-finished bookshelf, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Jonah's screams brought the neighbors running. His frantic 911 call, barely coherent through his sobbing, brought emergency responders racing through the storm to a crime scene that would divide Willow Creek even further. Detective Ruth Calder arrived within 20 minutes, her experienced eyes immediately cataloging the evidence. No signs of struggle. No indication of robbery. Victor's wallet and tools were untouched. This was a targeted killing, personal and deliberate. The murder weapon was found in a drainage ditch half a mile from the house. When they traced the serial number, the results sent shockwaves through the investigation. The gun was registered to Reverend Alden Granger. Even more damning, surveillance footage from the gas station 3 blocks away showed Alden's distinctive sedan driving toward the Ellsworth neighborhood at 9:02 p.m. and returning in the opposite direction at 9:52 p.m., a timeline that perfectly matched the murder. This case has more twists than you can imagine, and the evidence we've seen so far is just the beginning. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss how this investigation unfolds. The truth behind Victor's murder is more complicated than anyone in Willow Creek could have predicted. When police arrived at Alden's temporary residence to question him about the gun and his whereabouts, they found a man whose guilt seemed written across his face. But was it guilt over murder, or guilt over the affair that had set these deadly events in motion? The investigation was just beginning, and everyone involved was about to learn that the night Victor died, the whole truth died with him. Detective Ruth Calder had been working homicide cases for 18 years, and she'd learned that the most shocking crimes often had the most complex motives. As she stood in Victor Ellsworth's bloodstained workshop, examining every detail of the crime scene, she knew this case would test every skill she'd developed during her career. Ruth was methodical by nature and necessity. She photographed the scene from 12 different angles, cataloged every tool and piece of evidence, and noted inconsistencies that other investigators might have missed. The lack of defensive wounds on Victor's body told her he knew his killer. The single, precise shot to the chest suggested either professional training or extreme emotional focus. Most importantly, the killer had been calm enough to retrieve the shell casing, a detail that eliminated crimes of passion and pointed toward premeditation. Her first interview was with Mara Ellsworth, who had been staying at her sister's house since the scandal broke. Mara was devastated, oscillating between inconsolable grief and defensive anger. She insisted that despite their marital problems, she would never have harmed Victor. "He was a good man who didn't deserve what I put him through," Mara sobbed. "I made terrible choices, but I never wanted him dead. Never." Mara's alibi was solid. She'd been at her sister's house all evening, helping with her nephew's homework and watching television. 3 witnesses confirmed her presence, and her sister's neighbor had seen her car in the driveway from 7 p.m. until the next morning. Ruth's interview with Alden Granger was far more troubling. The disgraced pastor was agitated, defensive, and couldn't provide a clear account of his whereabouts during the crucial time frame. He claimed to be visiting a parishioner in crisis, but when Ruth contacted the supposed parishioner, they had no record of such a visit. "I was driving around thinking and praying," Alden finally admitted. "My life has been destroyed. I needed time to process everything that's happened." During a search of Mara's belongings, Ruth discovered something that changed the entire investigation. A shoebox filled with threatening notes that Mara had been receiving for weeks. The messages were cut from magazine letters and pasted onto cheap stationery. "End it or face the consequences. Your husband deserves to know the truth. Stop the affair or everyone will pay." Mara admitted she'd been receiving these notes for over a month but had dismissed them as cruel pranks from disapproving church members. She hadn't told Victor about them because she didn't want to cause him additional stress. "I thought it was just someone trying to scare me," she explained. "I never imagined they would actually hurt Victor." Ruth's investigation into the threatening notes led her to an unexpected discovery. While reviewing Victor's business records, she found irregular cash withdrawals from the company account. Small amounts, never more than $500, but consistent over the past 6 weeks. When she questioned Mara about these withdrawals, the truth finally emerged. Mara had been paying blackmail to Elias Monroe, a former employee of Victor's construction company who had been fired 3 months earlier for stealing tools. Elias had witnessed one of Mara and Alden's secret meetings in the church parking lot and had been extorting money from Mara ever since. He threatened to tell Victor about the affair unless she paid him to stay quiet. "I was desperate," Mara confessed. "I knew Victor would find out eventually, but I needed time to figure out how to tell him myself. Elias was bleeding us dry, but I felt trapped." Here's where this case takes a turn that no one saw coming. Sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine, and the real killer often hides in plain sight while everyone focuses on the obvious suspects. When Ruth brought Elias in for questioning, she expected to find a petty criminal who had stumbled into a profitable blackmail scheme. What she found instead was a man consumed with rage over his firing and desperate enough to escalate his crimes far beyond extortion. Elias initially denied any involvement in Victor's death, but his story began falling apart under Ruth's persistent questioning. He claimed to be home watching television the night of the murder, but had no witnesses to confirm his alibi. More damaging, his fingerprints were found on Alden's stolen gun. "I was there that night," Elias finally admitted, "but I didn't go there to kill him. I went to steal tools from his workshop. I needed money, and Victor owed me for the way he treated me." Elias's confession opened a new line of investigation. He admitted to breaking into Alden's house weeks earlier and stealing the gun, planning to sell it for quick cash. But when he arrived at Victor's workshop that night, he claimed he found Victor already dead. "I was going to take his power tools and get out," Elias insisted. "But when I opened the door, he was already on the floor. There was blood everywhere. I panicked and ran." Ruth pressed harder, knowing Elias was still lying. The timeline didn't match the surveillance footage, and his fingerprints were on the murder weapon itself, not just the grip. Under intense pressure, Elias revealed another crucial detail. He had been in contact with someone else about the affair, someone who had paid him additional money for information about Mara and Alden's meetings. But he refused to identify this mysterious third party, claiming he feared for his life. Ruth realized the case was far more complex than a simple love triangle gone wrong. Someone else was pulling strings, manipulating events from the shadows, and using Elias as their unwitting pawn in a deadly game of revenge. The investigation was about to take another shocking turn, one that would expose the real mastermind behind Victor Ellsworth's murder. After 12 hours of interrogation, Elias Monroe finally broke down and revealed the complete truth about his criminal activities leading up to Victor's murder. What emerged was a scheme far more elaborate and vindictive than Detective Ruth Calder had initially suspected. Elias hadn't simply stumbled upon Mara and Alden's affair by accident. He had been systematically watching the church property for weeks after his firing, looking for opportunities to steal valuable items or cause problems for Victor's business. During one of these surveillance sessions, he witnessed Mara and Alden in a passionate embrace in the pastor's car. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Elias admitted. "The perfect pastor and the perfect church lady going at it like teenagers. I knew this information was worth money." Elias had approached Mara the next week, showing her photographs he'd taken with his phone and demanding $500 per week to keep quiet. But the blackmail had escalated beyond simple extortion. He'd also been feeding information to someone else, someone who was paying him even more money for detailed reports about the affair's progression. When Ruth pressed Elias about this mysterious contact, his demeanor changed completely. The cocky criminal became genuinely frightened, looking over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. "They contacted me through anonymous texts," he explained. "Never gave me a name, never met in person. They just wanted to know everything about the affair, when they met, where they went, what they talked about. They paid me $200 for every detailed report." Ruth demanded to see these text exchanges, but Elias claimed he deleted them all on the mysterious contact's instructions. However, he did reveal one crucial detail. This person had specifically asked for information about Victor's daily routines, his work schedule, and when he would be alone at home. "That should have been a red flag," Elias admitted. "But I was getting good money, and I figured they were just another angry church member who wanted to expose the affair." Elias's account of the murder night contained details that both corroborated and contradicted the existing evidence. He admitted to driving to the Ellsworth property around 9:30 p.m., intending to steal tools from Victor's workshop while the man was distracted by his woodworking. "I parked down the street and walked up through the trees," Elias explained. "The storm was perfect cover, nobody could see or hear anything. I figured Victor would be in his workshop like always, and I could slip into the garage and grab some expensive tools." But when Elias approached the workshop, he claimed he saw something that changed everything. A shadowy figure emerging from the building, moving quickly toward a car parked on the opposite side of the property. "I couldn't see who it was because of the rain and darkness," Elias insisted. "But it definitely wasn't Victor. This person was smaller, moving fast like they were panicking." According to Elias, he waited several minutes after the mysterious figure left before approaching the workshop. When he opened the door and found Victor's body, he panicked completely. There was blood everywhere, and Victor was just lying there with his eyes open, Elias said, his voice shaking. "I knew I needed to get out of there, but I also knew my fingerprints were going to be all over that place from when I'd scoped it out before." In his panic, Elias claimed he picked up the murder weapon without thinking, then immediately dropped it when he realized what he was holding. This explanation accounted for his fingerprints on the gun, but Ruth wasn't buying the story completely. The problem with Elias's confession was that every crucial detail was unverifiable. The mysterious contact used untraceable phones and anonymous payment methods. The shadowy figure he claimed to see couldn't be identified or corroborated by any other evidence. His timeline was close to the surveillance footage but not exact enough to be conclusive. Ruth had a suspect who admitted to being at the crime scene, whose fingerprints were on the murder weapon, and who had multiple motives for wanting Victor dead. But she also had a story that suggested someone else was the actual killer, someone who had been manipulating events from the beginning. After 3 weeks of investigation, Ruth found herself with more questions than answers. She had suspects with motives, means, and opportunity. She had physical evidence that pointed in multiple directions. But she didn't have the one thing she needed most: definitive proof of who actually pulled the trigger. The case was stalling, and Ruth knew that without a breakthrough soon, Victor Ellsworth's killer might never face justice. Within 6 months of Victor's murder, Willow Creek Fellowship had lost more than half its congregation. What had once been a thriving community of faith became a hollow shell of its former self. Sunday morning services that used to fill 200 seats now struggled to attract 60 worshipers, most of them elderly members who had nowhere else to go. The church board, led by the increasingly desperate Eunice Harrow, tried everything to salvage their congregation. They brought in guest speakers, organized healing services, and even attempted to rebrand the church with a new name. Nothing worked. The scandal had poisoned the well too deeply for quick recovery. The fellowship hall where wedding receptions and funeral luncheons had brought the community together for decades now sat empty most days. The youth group disbanded entirely when parents couldn't agree on appropriate leadership. Even the annual Christmas pageant, a Willow Creek tradition for over 40 years, was canceled indefinitely. Pastor Alden Granger submitted his resignation in a brief, emotionless letter that avoided any admission of guilt for Victor's death while acknowledging his moral failures regarding the affair. He never preached another sermon at Willow Creek Fellowship, never said goodbye to the congregation he'd served for 5 years, and never publicly expressed remorse for the devastation his actions had caused. Within 2 weeks of his resignation, Alden had packed his belongings and left town under cover of darkness. Rumors suggested he'd moved to another state, possibly seeking counseling or attempting to rebuild his ministry elsewhere. But no one in Willow Creek knew for certain, and frankly, most people no longer cared where he'd gone. The parsonage where the Granger family had lived stood empty for months, a constant reminder of how quickly trusted leadership could crumble. Eventually, the church was forced to sell the property to cover mounting debts from decreased donations and legal fees. Mara Ellsworth became a pariah in her own hometown. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Store clerks served her with cold politeness that made clear she was no longer welcome. Parents forbade their children from playing with Jonah, treating the family like carriers of a contagious moral disease. Unable to endure the constant judgment and hostility, Mara made the painful decision to leave Willow Creek permanently. She and Jonah relocated to a city 3 hours away, where she found work as a receptionist and attempted to rebuild their lives under a different last name. The house where she and Victor had raised their family sat empty for over a year before finally selling to newcomers who knew nothing of its tragic history. Mara never returned, not even for Victor's anniversary or to visit his grave. Helen Granger eventually returned to Willow Creek with her children, but the woman who came back bore little resemblance to the confident pastor's wife who had left. She was withdrawn, suspicious, and seemed to flinch whenever someone mentioned her former husband's name. Helen found a job at the local library and slowly began rebuilding her life as a single mother. She attended a different church in the neighboring town, never setting foot in Willow Creek Fellowship again. Her children struggled with the transition, dealing with both their father's abandonment and the community's mixed reactions to their family's tragedy. Jonah Ellsworth, now 18, carried trauma that would follow him for years. Losing his father to violence and watching his mother become a social outcast had fundamentally changed his perspective on trust, community, and faith. He left for college as soon as possible, rarely returning to visit the town that held such painful memories. Detective Ruth Calder never closed the case, keeping Victor's file on her desk as a reminder of justice denied. She continued investigating leads in her spare time, convinced that the real killer was still walking free somewhere. The community that had once prided itself on closeness and moral certainty learned harsh lessons about how quickly trust could be destroyed and how difficult it was to rebuild once shattered. The story of Willow Creek teaches us that trust, once broken, creates destruction far beyond the original betrayal. Victor didn't just lose his wife, he lost his faith in humanity, his sense of security, and ultimately his life. Mara didn't just lose her marriage, she lost her community, her identity, and her son's childhood innocence. When we place our trust in others, especially those in positions of authority, we make ourselves vulnerable in ways we rarely consider. The deeper the trust, the more catastrophic the betrayal becomes. Victor's complete faith in both his wife and his pastor created the perfect conditions for devastating deception. Pastor Alden's actions represent one of the most insidious forms of manipulation: spiritual abuse. He used his position as a religious leader to exploit a grieving woman's vulnerability, twisting theology to justify immoral behavior and convincing Mara that their relationship was somehow blessed by God. This type of abuse is particularly dangerous because victims often blame themselves rather than recognizing the manipulation. When someone we view as morally superior tells us something is acceptable, we tend to silence our own internal warnings. Mara ignored every red flag because she trusted Alden's spiritual authority more than her own moral compass. One affair destroyed multiple families, split a congregation, damaged children's faith in adults, and ultimately led to murder. This case demonstrates how moral compromises create expanding circles of damage that touch innocent people who never made the original poor choices. Jonah lost his father and his stable home life because of decisions made by adults he trusted. Helen's children lost their father's presence and their community's respect. Church members lost their spiritual home and their faith in religious leadership. The consequences extended far beyond the original participants. How do we protect ourselves from manipulation by authority figures? The answer lies in maintaining our own moral standards regardless of who's asking us to compromise them. When someone in authority suggests that normal rules don't apply to your relationship, that's a warning sign. What are the red flags of spiritual abuse? Watch for leaders who share inappropriate personal information, who suggest they understand God's will better than established moral principles, or who encourage secrecy about your relationship with them. How can communities heal from such betrayal? Healing requires acknowledging the damage, establishing new accountability systems, and rebuilding trust slowly through consistent, transparent actions over time. The most important lesson from Willow Creek is that no one, regardless of their position, their reputation, or their spiritual authority, should be trusted without accountability. Healthy relationships and communities require transparency, boundaries, and the courage to speak up when something feels wrong. What do you think really happened that night in Victor's workshop? Was it Elias, driven by desperation and rage? Was it someone else entirely, manipulating events from the shadows? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it made you think differently about trust, betrayal, and the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. The truth may never be known, but the lessons from Willow Creek will remain relevant as long as humans struggle with power, temptation, and the choice between self-interest and integrity. Today, more than 5 years after Victor Ellsworth's murder, his case file sits in Detective Ruth Calder's desk drawer, marked Cold Case Open Investigation. Despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence, multiple suspects with clear motives and physical evidence pointing in several directions, no one has ever been charged with his killing. Elias Monroe served 18 months in prison for blackmail and weapons charges, but prosecutors couldn't prove he pulled the trigger. Alden Granger disappeared into obscurity, his whereabouts unknown to authorities or his former congregation. Mara Ellsworth rebuilt her life under a new identity, but the shadow of suspicion follows her still. The residents of Willow Creek remain divided in their theories about what really happened that stormy November night. Some believe Elias killed Victor during a botched robbery, panicked, and created the affair connection to throw suspicion onto others. Others are convinced that Alden committed the murder to silence the husband who could have destroyed what remained of his reputation. A third group suspects Mara herself, arguing that she orchestrated Victor's death to free herself for a new life with Alden. And a few insist that someone else entirely, perhaps the mysterious contact who was paying Elias for information, committed the murder while using the affair as a convenient cover. Detective Calder continues to believe that crucial evidence remains hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. She keeps in contact with Jonah Ellsworth, now 23 and living across the country, hoping that someday he might remember a detail that could break the case open. But as years pass and witnesses age, memories fade, and evidence degrades, the likelihood of solving Victor's murder diminishes. The truth about what happened in that workshop may have died with Victor himself. The town of Willow Creek never fully recovered from the scandal and murder that destroyed its sense of safety and community trust. The Fellowship Church eventually closed its doors permanently, unable to attract enough members to sustain operations. Many families moved away, seeking fresh starts in communities not haunted by memories of betrayal and violence. The story of Willow Creek serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the most trusted faces. Sometimes those we turn to for comfort become the source of our greatest pain. And sometimes the truth is buried so deep that even justice can't reach it. Victor Ellsworth deserved better than the betrayal that destroyed his marriage and the violence that ended his life. His story reminds us that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired, and that some secrets are deadly enough to kill for.